Hello and welcome. I'm very happy to tell you all welcome to our event, to our final event of the program Arts. Hello and welcome in our to our program Arts and Politics. I'm extremely happy to introduce you today, Catherine Nichols, who had to be here with us today, but in Sofia, I mean, but unfortunately that's not possible in the current situation. But we still have her online with us. And before I give her the floor to start with the lecture, I'm going to tell you a little bit more about her, but also about the program Arts and Politics. With this event, we're actually closing the exhibition Art and Politics, confrontations and coexistence at the Structural Gallery in Sofia, Bulgaria. This was an exhibition with works by Otto Dix, Günther Uecker, Hanne Höch, Gerhard Richter, and Joseph Beuys, of course, with the Bulgarian participation of Antonij Rejekov. And this was a very special exhibition for us, for Bulgaria, for the Bulgarian art scene as well, because of course we also had works by Joseph Beuys, which is not that common to see here in Bulgaria. And now with this event, we're closing the exhibition and we're closing the program Art and Politics, but we're also opening another program for next year. And this is the celebration of 100 years of the birth of Joseph Beuys, one of the biggest names of German art. And here with us is Catherine Nichols, who is an arts and literary scholar, curator, and writer based in Berlin. She completed her doctorate at the University of New South Wales in Sydney, Australia. And she has curated a wide range of contemporary art and cultural history exhibitions on topics ranging from the Reformation to the Passions, from the sun to sexuality. She has curated a couple of exhibitions dedicated to Joseph Beuys and his work. So it's not a surprise that she was selected to be the artistic director of the centenary program Beuys 2021, 100 years of Joseph Beuys, which will include some 30 cultural events in North Rhine-Westphalia. More about herself, but also about the topic of the current lecture you will find out by her herself. Catherine, hello, are you there?
Yes, I'm there. I'm here.
Hi, welcome.
Hi, thank you, Stefka.
And I wish to all our viewers a really exciting time. And I would like to remind you all who are watching us online on YouTube that you can also ask questions. So if you have any comments or questions, please write them down in the YouTube chat, and I will take care that Catherine receives the questions and answer to them. Thank you, Catherine, and see you in a bit.
Thank you, Stefka, for the very warm introduction. And thank you very much to Marina Luderman also for inviting me to talk to you today. It's a great pleasure for me and it's an honor. Needless to say, I'd much rather be in Sofia. I've never been to Sofia before, and I'd much rather be talking to you in person. As I'm sure you all know, it's extremely strange to be talking into an empty space or a seemingly empty space, but I guess I can feel your presence a little. I'm working on Joseph Beuys at the moment, as Stefka said, intensely, constantly. If Beuys were alive today, he would be about to turn 100. So the federal German state of North Rhine-Westphalia, where Beuys lived, taught, and worked, has set itself the task of examining why we should care about this centenary now. Why is Beuys worth celebrating? Sorry, is that working?
No, not yet.
Working, just wait one more moment. And now?
Yes. Can you just turn on the full screen option?
Damn, no. Sorry. Try again. How's that? Better? Is that working now, Stefka? Stefka? Is that working?
Yes.
Okay, good. And my apologies. So why is Beuys worth celebrating? How compromised is he by the mythology he purposely cultivated? More importantly, why is it worth taking the opportunity of this anniversary to critically engage with the political Beuys, with the ideas he came up with and the questions he raised? Does it make sense to focus not only on Beuys as a controversial figure of historical interest, as someone who, with his expanded concept of art, his theory of social sculpture, altered the course of art history, but also, and perhaps more importantly, to examine the ways in which the central idea underlying this understanding of art, namely that everyone is an artist, and the ways that manifests itself in Beuys's prolific cosmos of an oeuvre. At the same time, we ask how and whether we might be able to do something with that idea, at the very least to do some good fast thinking on democracy, capitalism, climate change, and on where we as human beings fit into the trouble, which, to cite Donna Haraway, we are going to have to stay with if we are to survive. Can, in other words, Beuys's theory of social sculpture help us to go beyond merely reiterating his critique of capitalism and his calls for a more democratic democracy, towards developing a convincing, collective, transformative practice able to counteract the erosion of human, animal, and environmental rights, the rise of populism, the spread of oppressive regimes, and imminent climate catastrophe? What kind of democracy would we need to deal with the challenges we face? My colleague and friend, Eugen Blume, and I have been invited to guide this critical process by putting together a program for 2021. And with the help of Goethe-Institut, by linking the activities of that program with other events going on around the world, from Jakarta to Tokyo to Ulaanbaatar, Warsaw, Berlin, and Sofia. Eugen has been thinking about Beuys since the mid-1970s. For me, the encounter with Beuys came much later. I come from Sydney and spent way more of my childhood at the beach than in museums. I could have seen a major work by Beuys in the National Gallery of Australia during my childhood, The Stripes of the House of the Shaman, but I didn't. I first realised who Beuys was when I moved to Berlin to finish my PhD in 1999. A few years later, I began working at the Hamburger Bahnhof, where many pivotal works by Beuys are held, such as Tram Stop, Monument for the Future, The End of the 20th Century, Directional Forces for a New Society, and Unschlitt Talor. A few years after that, Eugen invited me to co-curate the Beuys retrospective Beuys die Revolutions in Wir, We Are the Revolution, with him. And in the 12 years to have elapsed since then, we've returned to working on Beuys again and again. I think that Eugen never really stops working on Beuys. I sometimes do. The program we've put together for Beuys 2021, in close collaboration with our colleagues from over 30 different cultural institutions in North Rhine-Westphalia, is conceived as a critical conversation with and about Beuys. While we've chosen to deal with certain questions in the context of projects that we are working on directly as part of the program, the vast majority of topics were proposed by our colleagues, what they have in common, and what makes them collectively stand out from previous Beuys-related exhibitions and projects, is that conventional art historical concerns take a back seat to the transformative, to the social, the economic, the environmental, the political, to Beuys's communication strategies, his influence on contemporary art, thought, scientific practice, and institutional critique. There are no events, in other words, with titles like Joseph Beuys Drawings from 1949 to some time or other, or Joseph Beuys Actions, Environments, Vitrines. The majority of the events are exhibitions, yet there are also lectures, performances, concerts, theatre, laboratories, book releases, and an online platform called Goethe-Institut, which will feature a virtual exhibition, an AR experience, a film program, as well as radio podcasts, playlists, and a sound archive presenting short clips on Beuys, all of which combine to show how many different and often contradictory perceptions of Beuys have emerged from the mid-1960s, when he began to become a public figure, right through to the present day. The PR campaign, developed by the Berlin-based graphic designers Zyan, conveys a sense of the discursive nature of the program we have in mind, an undertaking which honours Beuys in the only way he would have wanted, by talking to him, by critiquing, rejecting, overhauling, or building upon his work. So it's not the first time I've spent a couple of years at a time so immersed in thinking and writing about his practice. Even though I usually prefer to keep moving, I'm not bored yet, even though I'm usually not so keen on people who talk too much, who hold the floor or labour the point. And even though in general I'm pretty wary of men in long coats with followers, men who write messages to society in capital letters, however much they might be referencing the anarchist tradition, I remain intrigued. It's because Beuys was one of the most contradictory, most ambivalent, most provocative and idiosyncratic figures in the history of art. It's because he loved James Joyce, because he played with and even sought to generate a new language, and because he was funny. It's because he developed and embodied persona after persona after persona, from gangster to shaman to redeemer, from scientist and alchemist to animal. It's because he compulsively made lists and weird equations, because he had founded a political party for animals of which he himself was a member, because he was a voracious reader with a penchant for poetic truth, because he had the audacity to believe he could help countless writers, philosophers, artists, and political theorists, whether it was Novalis, Friedrich Nietzsche, Karl Marx, or Marcel Duchamp, to bring their thought to its logical conclusion. I remain intrigued because of the fragility of his drawings, both of the figures and the lines, because of his awkward, faltering, formative attempts to somehow try to come to terms with Auschwitz, whatever that might mean, at a point in time when no one else apart from Theodor Adorno and Hannah Arendt had even made a start. I'm captivated by the sheer inexhaustibility of his attempts to get people to join him in coming up with a universalism and open-ended, process-based utopianism in the here and now that would not end in totalitarianism. A social revolution where not one drop of blood would be shed. A revolution that we, and that we, for Beuys included all people, would be, rather than carry out, a revolution that we would permanently embody by thinking of ourselves as artists and acting as such, rather than attempting some fleeting overturning of the status quo, only to return to the same structures with different protagonists. What worried Beuys back then and what worries me now, and here I'm hardly alone, is the time frame. Do we have time for the gradual transvaluation of values we would need in order to ensure any kind of enduring peace and social justice? Can we afford to proceed at an evolutionary pace when it feels like the house is on fire? Like Friedrich Schiller observing the descent of the French Revolution into terror, or later the anarchist thinker Emma Goldman looking on in horror and disillusionment at the Russian Revolution as one system of violent oppression superseded another. Beuys, as we will see, suggests that the slow structural transformation of ideas and behaviours is the only option we have, no matter how dire things might have become. Any acceleration of the process, according to Beuys, would be contingent upon the rapid, widespread acceptance of his theory of social sculpture, on everyone recognising their creative scope, their responsibility, and what is to be done, the task at hand. Before we move on to looking at some of the works, I want to offer you a brief overview, or to remind you of who it is we're looking at. Beuys was born not long after the end of the First World War in May 1921. He came of age under National Socialism in the Lower Rhine region in Germany's west, was an enthusiastic member of the Hitler Youth, and later served in the Air Force. He survived a plane crash in circumstances he went on to mythologize as a rescue by Siberian Tatars in an overt and deliberate conflation of his life and his work. To this day, this literary or sculptural approach to his own biography is at the center of his reception. It polarizes the discourse and makes it revolve around the question of whether or not Beuys was a liar, of whether or not his storytelling, his adoption of roles and personae, his reimagining of his life as a series of exhibitions, epiphanies, and expansions of other people's projects can be considered a legitimate practice for an artist. Art critics Benjamin Buchloh, Beat Wiss, and most recently the Beuys biographer Hans-Peter Riegel have been the most prominent voices to argue that Beuys's self-mythology is disingenuous. Eugen and I have had no interview about Beuys. We've not been asked to comment on the debate. Following the defeat of the Axis powers, Beuys returned to a country in ruins, physically, morally, and emotionally. He studied at the Art Academy in Düsseldorf, where he found that it was pretty much business as usual. Upon completing his studies, he entered into an extended period of existential crisis, partly brought about by self-doubt and personal matters, partly by his growing realization and acknowledgement of the atrocities in which he, and more or less everybody else he had ever known, had been complicit, and partly by the sense that things could not go on as though nothing had happened, as though society were not fundamentally broken. To him, modernism in the arts seemed as bankrupt as society at large. The concerns of the Art Academy seemed as misguided as the conflation of economic recovery with freedom and democracy. It took him about 4 years of withdrawal to find a way out of the crisis. His gradual healing, his personal transformation during the late 1950s became the model for his expanded concept of art, which he came to view as his best, and indeed his only work of art, a kind of Gesamtkunstwerk containing all else. Beuys was convinced that his own experience was so universal that it could apply to everyone else, and even to society as a whole. What followed in the 1960s was a professorship at the Academy, the instantiation of what Beuys called his primordial materials, fat, felt, and copper, the performance of numerous actions, at first with the Fluxus artists, then more on his own, the beginnings of his incorporation of the media into his practice, and his discovery of his class at the Academy as a model of social sculpture in the 1960s. In the 1960s and 70s. In the 70s and early 80s, partly precipitated by his expulsion from his teaching position for having allowed hundreds of students to be in his class, Beuys became increasingly involved in politics against the backdrop of the student movement, the conflict in Vietnam, the growing opposition to nuclear disarmament, and the birth of the environmental movement. The easiest way to summarize this period is by looking at the three models of social sculpture Beuys presented at Documenta 5, 6, and 7, held in the years 1972, 1977, and 1982, respectively. At Documenta 5, Beuys presented his Organization for Direct Democracy, which he'd been running with others in Düsseldorf. People were invited in to collect information, material, and to engage in conversation with the artist and one another about the issues concerning them, the workings and failings of representative democracy, and how direct democracy could be an effective means of feeling and actually being enfranchised. The object was to encourage visitors to the space to recognize their individual sovereignty and to put that sovereignty to work in actively participating in the decision-making processes affecting their lives. By the following Documenta in 1977, Beuys had recognized the significance of reflecting on and changing the role of capital if there were to be any social change, and had shifted education to the core of his project. This time around, he exhibited the Free International University at the Fridericianum, holding classes there through the 100 days of the exhibition. He famously installed a honey pump in the rotunda of the museum as a metaphor for the kind of heart he was proposing for society, a heart pumping warm, nourishing, healing, generative substance, evocative of creativity instead of cold, hard capital. While he continued to critique the limits of representative democracy, by this point in time, he no longer seemed to consider that form of democracy a viable solution. The FEU became the central pillar of his emancipatory project. It is one of hundreds, perhaps even thousands of reform or anti-universities with an interdisciplinary and radical pedagogical approach. It has precedents in Black Mountain College, for example, and has countless imitators. Initially, it was supposed to be funded by the government, to have a fixed address and curriculum. A feasibility study in this vein was submitted to the EEC, but failed to secure the necessary funding. As a result, the university evolved into an itinerant, nomadic kind of affair with small branches all over the world. Some of them still exist to this day, though it's probably accurate to say that the FIU, reached its apotheosis in Kassel in 1977. Nowhere was it more coherent. Nowhere did it more convincingly succeed in bringing together the broad demographic Beuys aspired to make part of the conversation. No doubt this had as much to do with the visual force of Beuys's machinic metaphor, the honey pump, and his constant presence, as it did with the international audience of Documenta. The absence of Beuys has remained a stumbling block for all of the ongoing projects he left to posterity. Much of their weight, their political clout, was carried by his charisma, by his capacity to generate powerful new imaginaries by means of speaking, acting, writing, and making things in front of people, a capacity substantially attenuated by his death. By the following Documenta in 1982, Beuys had shifted his primary focus to the environment. In the lead up, he had co-founded Germany's first Green Party, unsuccessfully run for a seat in the European Parliament. Here, once again with the FEU, he organised the planting of 7,000 trees around Kassel by citizens of the city to replace the countless trees that were destroyed in the Second World War. Raising the funds alone was a mammoth task which occupied Beuys for a considerable length of time. Each tree was planted side by side with an anthropomorphically shaped basalt stone. In an uncanny anticipation of the Anthropocene, one of the most pivotal terms of our age, he thus juxtaposed biological and geological time to make one of the most evocative, ambitious, largest and most iconic social sculptures. At the outset, the stones were piled up like corpses in an image unmistakably redolent of the senseless death of multitudes of people in the course of the Second World War, whether in concentration camps, bombing campaigns, or in battle. Beuys did not live to see the completion of the project. The final tree was planted at Documenta 8 in 1987, about a year and a half after his death. The concept behind Beuys's theory of social sculpture, as manifested in these three major models, is in itself pretty straightforward. Beuys used one performative aphorism to capture it, as I mentioned a moment ago, that everyone is an artist. That all of us, irrespective of who we are, irrespective of where we come from, of what we spend our days doing, irrespective of our sexuality, our religion, or our politics, has an innate creativity. All of us have the capacity to think, to speak, to form ideas, words, and situations, at least in our minds. To join forces with others in some way, to bring material and immaterial things or structures into being, to make some things happen and to prevent other things from happening, to bring forth, like science fiction, speculative visions of the future that help us to think our way beyond the paralysis of the present. Each of these sculptural practices, as Beuys saw it, makes us artists and endow us with the capacity to heal and shape our own lives and the society in which we live. What I find really interesting about this idea is that for all the seeming totality of a statement beginning with the words "everyone is," a universalism that we cannot help but find a little suspect today, Boyce's approach actually anticipates the concerns articulated within contemporary discourses on difference, intersectionality, and potentially even multi-species. Being an artist, as Boyce uses the term, means being united with others for the sole reason that you can think and thus create in some way. It's a form of identity that doesn't at all preclude others or exclude others for that matter. You can identify as a queer, Catholic, economic conservative, say, a cisgender, disabled man, or any number of other codes of belonging, and know that being an artist as well, you will have some existential bond with others you may or may not like, a bond that's founded upon your common creative potential, a bond that enables you to join forces in some kind of worlding practice, no matter how conflicted or fraught that practice might be. Boyce himself didn't come up with the idea, nor did he pretend to have. He always named his sources. What was original, though, was his all-consuming attempt to find a way to transform a philosophical trope lifted from German Romanticism and German idealism into a practical methodology for making society more democratic and just. This attempt saw him change from a shy and withdrawn person into someone who, to cite the art historian Walter Graskamp, took hold of a microphone and never let go of it again. It saw him broadcasting the same idea, albeit with shifting focuses for some 20 years on every channel available to him. Imagine if he'd had Twitter and Instagram at his disposal. And it saw him exhaustively evolve a new visual, oral, and material vocabulary, a new imaginary that touched people on a profoundly emotional level. In looking at the diverse responses to have emerged to this methodology that Boyce endeavoured to develop, his science of freedom, as he liked to call it, it becomes clear that people really struggled to understand his idiosyncratic and syncretistic sampling of ideas drawn primarily from the anthroposophical writings of Rudolf Steiner. You no doubt have seen the blackboard drawings. That increasingly became part of his practice. While he was talking, people were often captivated by his fur-coated charisma and his conviction that he was on the right track. Yet later they often had trouble recapitulating what they thought they had learned. What remained was less the content or the method, which pretty much only Boyce and his acolytes could reconstrue, than the imagery he came up with, the questions he raised, the impetus, the spaces that he created inside and outside the art world for the thrashing out of difficult ideas among people of very different backgrounds with highly divergent agendas and modes of communication. If you're familiar with the writings of John Dewey, say, or of Hannah Arendt or Chantal Mouffe, you could say that Boyce had made a significant contribution to the examination of models of the kind of performative, participative, agonistic democracy they each considered healthy, a democracy that thinks of itself as a permanent conference, as exhausting as that might be, as a forum that is not only open to, but actually needs everyone, a site of encounter that can not only withstand conflict among people, but that regards such conflict, such vital and ongoing debate as the very lifeblood of democratic culture. Boyce himself thought that the wound, the trauma, was the best or perhaps the only place to begin thinking, to begin talking, to begin to transform the cold sculptures humanity has created into what Boyce called warm sculptures. In engaging with Boyce's work, I wouldn't normally feel compelled to adhere to the artist's own approach. I'd much prefer to have more critical distance, but strangely enough, I'm going to do just that. Not because of Boyce's imperative, but because I've been watching the 2019 documentary on Donna Haraway called Storytelling for Earthly Survival. I already mentioned her once at the beginning of the talk, and I'm sure I'm going to do it again. The reason is that she is so utterly persuasive in her contemporary articulation of the wounded, damaged, traumatized state of the earth and the critters to use Haraway's term, that inhabit it. She's so precise in her depiction of the trouble we're in and of the need to stay with that trouble, albeit not in the sense of forever refining our critique of that trouble, of forever retelling the deadly story we're living, or of being mesmerized by the power of that destructive, seemingly all-consuming narrative. What she argues, rather, in, as we will see, a very similar vein to Boyce, if not the same, is that we must refuse the paralysis of that critique, as seductively intelligent as it might be, that we must revolt against the presumption that the world is finished because we think we know how it works. We need, so Haraway argues, to change the story, to engage in the materialist practice of thinking together with other thinkers, to render one another capable of telling other stories, of creating new social imaginaries based on the principle of making kin, of becoming with each other across peoples and species on this earth. Good thinking, Haraway says, always happens at the moment of speechlessness. And this is precisely where Boyce is at his best, where he is, I would argue, the most relevant, the most pertinent to today. Not so much as an artist who inspires other art world artists, for want of a better way of putting it, to move their work outside the museum, to focus on socially engaged practices in the manner of Suzanne Lacey, Theaster Gates, or Rick Lowe, for example, though such an effect is undoubtedly both true and worthwhile. Rather, it is as an artist who at least tries to show all of us, irrespective of our affinity for art world art, how to go about telling a story that is different from the daily one we're currently hearing and co-producing. So in thinking about Boyce thinking, when we have so little time, does it make more sense to look at the moment of speechlessness we encounter at the start of his artistic trajectory in the late 1940s and early 1950s, or at the moment of speechlessness we encounter 3 decades later, again in a work produced towards the end of his life? Do we, in other words, focus on Auschwitz, on Hiroshima, on the so-called 0 hour, the birth of the nuclear age, and the conditions of violence on an unprecedented scale, conditions that Boyce made it his mission to transform? Or is it more pertinent to the collective political and planetary predicament we're in now to look at Boyce's 1983 work, Pain Room? Somehow, I think it is. Boyce created his Pain Room for the Konrad Fischer Gallery in Düsseldorf in 1983, just a year after he'd begun 7,000 Oaks at Documenta 7. The full title of the environment is Hinter dem Knochen wird gezählt, Schmerzraum, or Behind the Bone, it's being counted, Pain Room. As you can see from the photograph, it's a space clad in metal sheeting entirely, that is reminiscent of the rooms used to interrogate and torture prisoners under the National Socialist regime, rooms that were later taken over by the Stasi, the East German secret police. The walls, the floor, the ceiling are all insulated by lead, the highly toxic material that alchemists were keen to transmute into gold. The space is dimly lit from above by a solitary light bulb, mounted alongside 2 metal rings. Perhaps some of you may have been inside the room in its current installation in Barcelona, where it's been on show since 2002. To me, the environment somehow has always stood out among the countless drawings, sculptures, actions, vitrines, manifestos, multiples, scores, lectures, panel discussions, interviews, and conversations that comprise Boyce's multifarious marketing campaign for his expanded concept of art. I think if I were to have first encountered this particular work without knowing beforehand that it had been created by Boyce, I may not have recognized it as such, as a work by him, as his. What makes it seem like an anomaly, though it is reminiscent of earlier metal pieces, such as the sculpture PTCOFE, or the chilling environment Zeige deine Wunde, Show Your Wound, is the radical austerity of the piece. It's dark, cold, claustrophobic, metallic brutality, wholly unmitigated by felt, or honey, or fat, by something soft, warm, organic, or in some way overtly transformative. The pain room never used to be the first work that sprang to mind when I thought about Beuys. Like most people, I tend to associate him first and foremost with his famous actions like explaining pictures to a dead hare, or the 1974 action with the coyote in New York, I like America and America likes me. But lately, my mind keeps returning to the pain room and what Beuys said about it. That's because when he was asked to comment on the work, his words were just as bleak and ominous as the space he had created. There is no question for me, he said, that the time bomb is ticking. Everything is so ossified that hardly any movement is possible. As we reach the tipping point on climate, bear witness to the rise of right-wing populism and the further erosion of rights for living and non-living beings. This has become one of the works that speak to me most on account of its brutal urgency. Back in 1983, when Beuys first showed the work, many people were taken aback that he would follow 7,000 Oaks with something so dark, something that at first glance seems to be telling a deadly story, to use Haraway's terminology, rather than weaving a new one. In fact, many people were surprised that Beuys continued to make works inside a gallery at all, having moved right outside the art world with his collective tree planting in Kassel. So why did Beuys continue to make conventional works of art? And why did he perform what seemed like a drastic narrowing of any scope for change, of any potential to avert catastrophe, when his previous major work had suggested the opposite, with the planting of thousands of trees alongside basalt stones, a wholly optimistic long-term project, an undertaking unrivaled in its epitomization of what social sculpture could be if people worked collectively towards a common goal. It felt for some as though he were contradicting himself, as though he somehow didn't really believe in his own proposal for social transformation, or that perhaps he had suddenly become disillusioned. Thinking about it from the perspective of staying with the trouble, though, of working with and shaping what we have, I read the pain room as the reminder of death that Beuys claimed kept him awake. It's the space behind the bone, where the heart is, that Beuys brings us into. It is the space where the heart, that is our clock, that is our internal time bomb, ticks. It's the space that could either be our own body or the social body at large, a space where the life-sustaining organ we imagine to be the seat of our emotions, in particular of love, is both insulated and isolated from the world beyond. Although there's only a tiny opening, going back to the picture now, a tiny opening to that world, there is one. In order to experience the work, we enter that charged, ambivalent, cold, warm space where we may or may not be joined by others. Either we're near the heart when we go in behind the bone to where the counting or countdown is taking place, or we ourselves become that heart, or at least part of that heart, by just being there. Bearing in mind that Beuys considered love to be the most creative force, more creative even than death, the space of pain is a site of potential transformation, more of a beginning than an end. It's the place of speechlessness, where good thinking might happen, where good thinking had better happen without delay. In contrast to his actions, where Beuys is the agent, the performative force, the shaman, the teacher, the explorer, the maker, in environments such as this one, we're the agents. If there is to be any action, any thinking or speaking here, it's up to us. So to return to the question I posed at the outset, can Beuys's theory and models of social sculpture help us to develop a convincing collective transformative practice? The short conclusion is yes, at least a little. For one, it provides us with what might be the only remaining futural ideal or transformative universal, the only everyone is kind of construction that we can work with and that can stand its ground. At least I can't think of another one right now. Then there's his thorough exploration of various models of persistent utopia based on the process-based principles of plasticity, which provides us with a critical insight or critical insights into what does and doesn't affect transformation. Evocative, open-ended imagery that both touches people and gets their imagination going is helpful for bringing people together. Developing a nebulous, wholly idiosyncratic rhetoric, a convoluted logic, perhaps less so. Finally, there's his commitment to staying with the trouble, to working with the mess we have, and his privileging of creativity as a means to do so. As for the question of what kind of democracy we would need in order to adequately address the challenges we face, especially in light of the rapid acceleration of automation, digitalization, artificial intelligence, and the new brand of subjectivity with which they go hand in hand, I don't know. It's one of the central questions we hope to develop an answer to in the course of 2021. One of the key projects dealing with that question will be Democracy Reboot 2056. It's an international futures laboratory conceived and run by filmmaker Andres Feil and content producer Jutta Doberstein. It will seek to collectively anticipate life as it will be, as modelled on current scientific predictions, and to imagine the form of government that life will require. Bearing in mind, to name just one example, that China is currently on track to outperform its liberal counterparts in addressing climate issues, one can only speculate what that might mean for democracy at large and for all our being, for our all being artists, for our being the revolution, for our being per se. Thank you.
Katrin, thanks a lot. It was super interesting, and I'm so grateful that we had the chance to have you here, like here online, because I think it's a great start for next year. I hope for you as well, because I guess you are loaded with tons of work for next year. But it's also for us a great start of thinking of this jubileum. Because Boris is still a well-known figure also in Bulgaria, but not so much with his political actions and his political activity. And before I ask my first question, I wanted also to remind our viewers that they can also ask questions in the chat section on YouTube. So if you're interested in asking something or commenting also, or on something that you just heard from Katrin, please leave your comment or question on YouTube or on Facebook. So Katrin, my question was, is somehow connected to our program Art&Politics, which we started earlier that year. And it was about, because the show which was the start of this program is a historic show. It starts from Autodics, like exactly 100 years ago, then it goes to through Joseph Beuys, and then we are ending here, 2020, in a pandemic time and so on. And we were asking ourselves, how has the role of the artist in political issues developed from the early 20th century to nowadays? Because also when we discussed with our director...
Oh, you're frozen, Stefka.
What, sorry?
You were frozen for a second. So how has the role of the artist changed throughout the 20th century in a political sense?
Yes, exactly. This is my question. And how is the role of the, and is this role of the political artist, activist, as Joseph Beuys was, still relevant today?
Yeah, I think it's really still relevant, and you can see it, and it's something that we'll be looking at during the Beuys year, in particular in the exhibition that's on show at K20 in Düsseldorf at the Kunstsammlung Nordrhein-Westfalen. And so I certainly think it is, and I chose in a way not to focus on that question today, interestingly, because I think that's where we often get stuck in thinking that, and that's why I wanted to just concentrate on why Beuys is actually even more radical than we give him credit for, because certainly he, I made that point just very briefly in my talk, that he is like one of the most inspiring figures to all activist artists, for all artists who've gone outside the museum, artists who sometimes exhibit at the museum or in an artistic context, and those who have left the museum behind them altogether. But what I think is even more exciting about Beuys, and what is often neglected, is the fact that he really extends that challenge to all of us to recognize where we can all work together with those artistic principles to change society. So I think it's both of those factors play an equal role in his influence, or should play an equal role, but they don't, actually, more to the point, they don't. And that's something that we really want to address with this exhibition in Düsseldorf. So that's a project that's co-curated by Isabel Maltz, who works at the museum directly, and Eugen Blume and I. And we've been really looking at how artists who do work within the art world, such as Suzanne Lacey, for example, I just mentioned, joins together with figures, more surprising figures like, say, Greta Thunberg is a prime example. And so that's somebody we want to sort of parallel, whose work we want to look at in parallel and see where they differ from one another and what we can learn from that difference, and what we can learn for actually making some kind of social change. Is it possible?
And can you elaborate a little bit more on the idea of education and the academy, and not only in the historic aspect of Beuys' vision of art education, but also on the current situation right now in most of, for example, European or American academies?
Yeah.
Have we achieved such a kind of more education, or we are still far away from it?
I think we're still far away from it. I think, and you can see that from what's interesting about the foundation of these anti-universities is that they come in waves, and there's been, since I think there's been a really long wave of the founding of anti-universities, of universities without conditions, models that somehow endeavour to make up for the shortcomings of this very bureaucratic, increasingly bureaucratic approach to education, where it's all what you would in German call Brotgelehrsamkeit, where it's all about learning to make yourself into an effective business model. And so you can see that there's this hunger on behalf of students, whether it's at art academies or whether it's at universities or any form of learning, even at school, even at primary school, where people are extremely frustrated by the fact that learning is not an end in itself, but that we're always learning to somehow fit effectively into a capitalist system that's stifling, and ultimately stifling not only of our personal creativity but of democracy as a whole. So, I mean, you can see how important education is, and for Beuys it became the central concern. Like, he started off with direct democracy, as I mentioned in the talk briefly, but he realized it wasn't enough. Like, the education was key, and he actually went on to even say that the academy will become the whole world. So he sort of thought of the academy even not just as an academy for like a small sort of pocket of knowledge or learning, but as a model for what society at large could be, that we would be like constantly at university, so to speak, that we're always learning, and that knowledge is where we can develop and live out our creativity, and that's pretty much the only potential that we have to actually actively take part in and shape democracy in a meaningful manner. Yeah.
I would like to ask a rather provocative question, and it's because in the very beginning you mentioned that one of the main characteristics of Beuys' work is precisely to transform notions of art. So and do you think that he, with his work, achieved that, to really fundamentally transform the notions of art and politics, and also of the artwork itself?
Mm.
How revolutionary was his art in humanity?
Well, I think that's a really fascinating question, because it's sort of like, you can even sort of take it back to how revolutionary was his idea about that everyone is an artist. And I think that with the various, you can see where Beuys comes from as an artist, that he doesn't invent the environment. he doesn't invent the action. He doesn't invent, in a way, these kinds of forms of lecture performance exactly, but what he does is, what's unique about Beuys is how he combines those things. And in a way, he was sort of a revolutionary figure and remains a unique revolutionary figure, but he doesn't succeed in leaving art behind him. And it's really hard to say, did he actually really ever intend to? It's always kind of ambivalent. Like, for me, a really clear example of this is the 7,000 Oak piece, and he was pretty withdrawn. There was a sort of an academy hooked up with that as well. And in contrast to the FEU, the documenter before, he didn't really play a key role in presenting the work, in discussing it, in engaging with it, with people locally. He tried to let other people do that, and that would be, to me, like saying, okay, that would be the revolution if he at some point he actually totally withdrew and said, okay, the social sculpture thing's up and running. But of course he didn't actually do that. The final gesture of that work, to make it finished as a work, he rode his bike across all of the blackboards that had been produced during that and made a line right across it. So he sort of still felt the necessity to include his presence, his signature, his traces. So obviously I think he thought this was a really long-term project, and he didn't claim to have wholly revolutionized that, but I think he definitely opened up a new imaginary for art, for society at large, and that's something that really does have a lasting impact. So I always sort of oscillate between thinking that it was really radically revolutionary and thinking, no, it was on the path to being revolutionary, and certainly he took a lot of people along with him, and his tendency to really piss a lot of people off or provoke people was equally inspiring, I think, to a lot of people, and remains so, because we're sort of reacting against Beuys is also really a hugely generative sort of affair. So yeah, definitely his impact shouldn't be underestimated. That's my conclusion.
And one more, maybe one last question, and it's about revolution and the revolution and its place in institutions and on the art market, because nowadays we can see Beuys in every big museum around the world.
Yeah.
And what's happening with revolution when it gets to the institution, when it gets on the art market as well? Because just yesterday we saw that number one at the art review top 100 most influential personalities is actually the movement Black Lives Matter. And what's happening when revolution enters the institutions and the market?
Yeah, I mean, usually you would think that every time something enters into a process of hyperstation, it dies, like it sort of becomes kind of paralyzed and immobilized, and that it's always easier for any oppositional force to be outside of an institution. I mean, the Free International University is a prime example of that. As soon as Beuys got it going, he got bored with it, and like by 1978, or not bored, but he became disillusioned and somehow thought it wasn't the way to go and began to move on. And I think that's a similar sort of thing. When I was a child, I used to form clubs all the time, and as soon as the club actually had a meeting, it was over. It was like, as soon as it actually started to get, and I think that there's something to that energy of being outside and not being, I mean, capitalism is so voracious, it consumes everything. It takes every oppositional movement inside it. It can accommodate everything. I mean, as you can see in like the critique of Luc Boltanski and Yves Capello and various people working on those lines. So I think that the revolution is not at home in the museum. It has to be outside, and I wonder what will happen to the Black Lives Matter movement actually if it continues. Or the Occupy was a perfect example of that too. Like that was at the Berlin Biennale, then it entered the museum, and in a way, I don't know if that was the beginning of its demise, but it certainly was part of it, or its dissipation. So that's also, it's a very difficult question to answer, because what do you do? Like Beuys obviously wanted to make use of the advertising potential of being in the museum, like of being at Documenta. He wanted people to get his message. So how do you get your message out there without it being in some way compromised or attenuated. So I don't have an answer to that question. Do you actually? How do you answer that?
On the one hand, I totally agree with you, and that was also my thought with Occupy Wall Street, which was like really strange in the House of Kave in Berlin during the Berlin Biennale, and it was really an example of some kind of a revolutionary spirit that looks like encaged there in the museum. But on the other hand, I think that sooner or later, institutions need to become part of that revolution, even if they kill a little bit of the revolutionary spirit, they sooner or later need to become part. And but let's see what will happen also with Black Lives Matter.
Yeah, you know, just one thing briefly about that is I'm really interested in Black Lives Matter is the question of how important is it for a movement like that to have a central figure, a charismatic figure, because I was just reading an article on BBC the other day about Black Lives. The interesting thing about Black Lives Matters is that there are sort of several people behind it and they are not at all prominent. And in contrast to pretty much every other movement, that's for me really interesting because it's been one of the most effective, far-reaching, rapid sort of spreading ideas and new imaginaries, to go back to that fabulous word, and perhaps inflationary word, but nevertheless very useful. I'm really curious to see about that, like where it will go from there too. Do we need to counter these really sort of populist, charismatic figures like Trump, who we may not have to mention for much longer, with another an alternative figure, or can a movement as much representative of the multitude actually succeed in ousting that other imagery? I don't know, like that's one question I'm really looking at closely, and I don't have an answer to either.
And one very last question. Can art change anything? Like it's a very broad, maybe even naivistic question, but I think it's important also to come back to it and critically ask it to ourselves. So has it any power, or no?
I think it does. I think I mean, I guess I wouldn't do my job if I didn't believe in that. But I think literature can change things. I think art can change things, and for the really key reason that I mentioned in my talk, and that is that it inspires us with the images. If we don't have images coming at us, if we don't have something that makes us think or that inspires us to move towards it, then nothing happens. So I think it's not that art is the only force capable of doing that, but it's one of the most effective forces for doing that, for just setting a thought process in motion, for touching people. And I mentioned that as well, about like ending on this the business of the heart and of the emotions. That's one of the reasons that why Beuys, I think, is such an effective artist and with such a lasting impact, is that he didn't, and that's you notice that with a lot of political art that you encounter, that it's like too afraid to sort of be emotional because that's somehow suspicious. So you get this kind of cold, like school project type political pieces that you sort of look at and walk away from. But I think where art can be really effective is if it reaches people on an intellectual and an emotional level and creates some surprising imagery that sets something in motion. And that's pretty much, I think, the most utopian, the closest to utopia we would get.
I think that's also a very, very nice ending of our conversation. And I invite also our viewers to think about it, like to think about art and its power, which is, I think, important and much needed in times as the ones we live in. Catherine, thanks a lot. And it's such a pity that we couldn't see you in person here in Sofia.
Yeah, it is.
But I hope that next year, maybe if you have some tiny little bit of time, between the many different initiatives that you're organizing, you will have time to come to Bulgaria. We would be happy to welcome you. And thank you very much again for the really interesting lecture. And we wish you best of luck with the huge thing, the huge project that you're working on in next year. Thank you very much and see you soon, hopefully.
Yeah, thank you so much, Stefka. And thank